Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It is Monday, January 19th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Hey, Jacob, how are you? Good to be
Hey,
with you.
Jessica. Hey, Jessica. Good to be with you again.
Yeah, it's your line. Okay. Yeah, it's good to be with you too. It is day 836 of the war. Today, we will discuss all the latest aspects of the Board of Peace that is being organized to rebuild and manage Gaza. We'll talk about the executive board that is being chosen, the members who are announcing themselves, Israeli anger over some of those board members, the committees, and the charter. All of it. Stay with us.
3 million Israelis are dealing with trauma since October 7th. To help Israelis heal, Hadassah is there, with the largest rehabilitation center in Jerusalem, world-renowned medical centers, and youth villages. It's said, saving a life saves the world. Imagine helping millions. This is Hadassah, a life-changing force in Israel and the world.
Okay, Jacob, I feel like this has been your focus very much so over the last couple of days. So where to start, really? What makes the most sense as we dive into this? Because really there's a lot of different headlines with the Board of Peace. We have different people who are all of a sudden being announced that they're part of the Board of Peace. We have some Israeli annoyance over some of those members. Why don't we start with the different committees, because they have similar names, some of them, and it's hard to discern what are the tasks of those various committees. And then we can talk about the committees and their members. Why don't we start from that point?
Yeah, I think your confusion is very warranted. I would say these past 3 days have been quite frustrating trying to understand the differences because there hasn't been a ton of information that's been given out by the administration. But basically what happened last week was what the Trump administration announced was we are moving on to phase 2 of their Gaza 20-point plan. And if you recall, phase 2 is supposed to be what's considered the permanent end of the war. Phase 1 was a temporary ceasefire. Now we're supposedly ending the war. Now Israel's still in 53% of Gaza, but the point of phase 2 is ending the war and then putting in new mechanisms that are in place to take over control of Gaza. So you have a whole slew of committees that are going to be involved in doing that. And it starts at the top with what's called the Board of Peace. And this is what's going to be headed by President Trump. And it will be including world leaders from around the globe. There were dozens of invitations sent out on Friday. And then we're hearing a drab of different countries announcing that confirming that they've received those invitations. And by announcing that, basically indicating that they're going to be agreeing and joining the board. So that's going to be the top oversight body for Gaza, but also what we'll talk a little bit about more is actually not just for Gaza, for all conflicts, because there's this effort to try to even usurp the UN and create a new international system. But that's at the top. Then you have what's called an executive board. And that's going to be made up of senior officials at the government level, but also from different fields. You'll have certain businessmen who are involved in it. I think Mark Rowan, the CEO of Apollo, is one of the people on the executive board. Tony Blair, the former UK Prime Minister. So that's going to be the operational arm of the Board of Peace, because the top level government leaders, they're not going to be really focusing on this too much. Maybe they'll meet a few times a year. They'll help with fundraising. But really, the executive boards are going to be the one doing things. And so you have this executive board for the Board of Peace. And then you have, unfortunately, what's called the Gaza Executive Board. And that is going to be actually specifically focused on Gaza. Yes, very confusing because they have the same name. And there wasn't, when I reached out to the White House, any explanation of what the differences between those two boards are. I've gathered over the past few hours that the General Executive Board, without the word Gaza in it, that's going to be just for all conflicts, whereas the Gaza one is specifically for Gaza. And that one's going to be headed by Nikolai Mladenov. And that's someone who you might be familiar with. He's the former UN Special Envoy for the Middle East peace process. So someone who's got a lot of good context in the region, is well liked by Israel and actually the various Palestinian factions. And in joining him and here's why Israel's upset, there's a senior Qatari official, Qatari diplomat named Ali Thawadi. who was very involved in the negotiations for the hostages, and also the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan. He's another prominent official who's also was involved in the negotiations towards the end for that ceasefire that we saw in January. So Turkey and Qatar have very prominent roles in this Gaza Executive Committee, which is going to be the main operating arm of the Board of Peace in Gaza. We'll be really closely monitoring another committee that's been created, which is called the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. And this is what is considered to be the
Quite a
committee
title.
of, the NCAG is what they're using the acronym for it, NCAG. They're going to be the Palestinian government. They're considered technocrats. They're not affiliated with the PA, technically. A lot of them are former PA. Even the head of it is a former PA deputy minister. And they're definitely not affiliated with Hamas. So that was the conditions that Israel and the U.S. had, that it has to be something new. And that's what they're trying to start. They have this new committee of 12 people at the moment who will basically act as ministers. They're called commissioners. They're each given a different portfolio that run the gamut, all the ones that you would expect, education, health, that kind of thing. And they're going to be overseen by this Gaza Executive Board, and you'll have Nikolai Mladenov, who's going to be the man on the ground, who's going to be kind of the conduit between all these different committees. So that's what's been set up. And now what you really need, though, is for this to work is to have money on the one hand, and then
Sure.
which is something that they're going to be talking about fundraising in the coming days. They're supposed to have the first meeting of the Board of Peace in Davos at the World Economic Forum that's supposed to be having this week. That's the hope. It hasn't been formally announced yet that that's going to be taking place. But once you're able to give funds to this, and we're probably going to need tens of billions of dollars in order to get this off the ground, because you're kind of starting from scratch. And then the last committee that's also talked about, but I think it's been deprioritized a little bit, much to Israel's chagrin, which is the International Stabilization Force. This is the security force, the multinational security force that's supposed to be deploying in Gaza, helping with securing humanitarian aid, securing the borders. And Israel obviously wants it to be involved in the disarmament process. There are not a lot of countries who are interested in this because they don't want to be going into combat with Hamas, which isn't. There's maybe talk of some disarmament program, but it's not going to be, Hamas isn't going to be giving everything up for free, is the expectation. So there's limited interest. So I think what they've decided to do is limit the scope of the mandate of the ISF to something more manageable for countries. And they do seem to say, the U.S., that they have enough at this point, volunteers willing to agree to contribute some amount of troops. They just won't be asked to do very much. And then there'll be a question of what the agreement that is reached on disarmament, if one is able to be reached. There's talk about differentiating between the heavy weapons and the light weapons, so that you start with the heavy ones and get Hamas to give up rocket launchers first. And that will pave the way for maybe a buyback program where you're giving them money for the lighter weapons. But that's really a long shot of whether or not that happens. But that's kind of related to the ISF. And you had a U.S. general who was going to be heading that. The U.S. also announced that a couple days ago. So those are the various committees. A lot going on. It's still very confusing. Hopefully we'll know a little bit more in the coming days, but also hopefully that gave a little bit of clarity.
For sure. Let's backpedal a little bit to the Israeli anger over some of those members who now have been announced. You have Turkey. You have Palestinian Authority, which of course was an issue not so long ago. What will happen now in terms of Israel's annoyance over some of those members? What does that really mean, on the ground, as Trump really wants to get this happening and working?
Yeah, just to clarify, I don't think there's any Palestinian Authority at this stage in terms of the executive committee. That was or the Gaza Executive Committee, that's what Israel was upset about.
That was the
there's no
difference.
PA.
They didn't want on the. Okay.
Correct. They don't want any PA involvement at all. We're seeing former PA on the technocratic committee, but that's not what their statement that they issued about. But it was an important clarification, or an important point that you made. They're upset, I think. They don't say specifically. Netanyahu's office issued a statement on Saturday night saying that the Gaza Executive Board was announced without any coordination with Israel, and it goes against Israeli policy. That was the statement. And it also mentions that Netanyahu directed Gideon Sa'ar to reach out to his U.S. counterpart Marco Rubio to express Israeli concerns. But if you take a look at the names, it's clear that they're most upset about Ali Thawadi, the Qatari diplomat, and the Turkish foreign minister being involved. Israel
Which
was
had been a red line, Jacob. Any kind of Turkish involvement.
right.
So what gives?
Exactly. I think since this announcement came out that I've seen certain people in this Netanyahu circle who have said, no, our red line was actually Turkish troops, not general Turkish involvement. It's unclear if that's really what the case was. I remember hearing red lines about any Turkish involvement and Qatari involvement. The rhetoric against Qatar is just as strong. I think what the reality of what we're seeing is that the Trump administration views these two countries, as very useful to him, that he feels that they were critical in getting Hamas on board for this ceasefire in January, that they were the guarantors, that Turkey specifically, Trump has a very close relationship with President Erdogan, and he likes to talk about how close they are in front of Netanyahu all the time. And Erdogan is someone who has been very, very critical of the war in Gaza and has compared Israel and Netanyahu. I think he's compared Netanyahu to Hitler. So there's obviously a lot of disappointment with the decision to have those two officials on this board. But as far as the U.S. is concerned, these are two countries that you need in order to get Hamas to still continue to play ball. And Israel is not willing to have. I think there are other countries that might have be more willing to step up, be it the UAE or others. But I think they also conditioned on Israel allowing for there to be more Palestinian Authority involvement, and for Israel to be willing to merge this process into a larger two-state solution. That's not where Israel is. So then you're left with the countries who are less, I guess, married to those ideas in some ways. I think the Qatar and Turkey just want to have a foothold in Gaza, and if nobody else wants to play that role, then they're happy to take it on because they do gain influence by getting involved and even being willing to pay for these things. And the response to the Israeli anger, which was pretty interesting, there was a very senior U.S. official who briefed a couple of reporters over the weekend who basically said, we don't really care about that Israel's upset. We didn't keep Israel in the loop on this because we knew that that Netanyahu was always going to push back. He wasn't willing to give on the PA, so this is what we're left with. And he's going to have to deal with it. We're the ones in charge of Gaza now, and Netanyahu's just going to have to get in line. Now, look, they're saying that privately. It's a very different relationship in public, as we see between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. But that's definitely the feeling for amongst Trump's top aides right now.
Wow. Okay. Let's take a quick break. When we're back, let's talk about some of the challenges, the first meeting of the Palestinian Technocratic Committee, challenges of that committee, and let's look at the Board of Peace Charter for a moment as well. So stay with us.
What if prayer doesn't work? This question strikes us as a distinctly modern one, an outgrowth of the slow disenchantment of the world. But in truth, the question is an old one, and one given space to breathe here.
Welcome to Thoughts and Prayers. I'm your host, Jessica Fisher. Join me on a deep exploration of the relationship between religion and modernity through personal stories, classical texts, and conversations with leading rabbis, scholars, and educators.
You're almost not supposed to be doing this interview.
Our prayers accumulate on God's doorstep, piled outside like an unimaginably tall stack of letters. We cannot give up on the relationship because God doesn't come to the door as quickly as we may like. So let's keep knocking. Perhaps the gates of compassion will be opened.
Join us every week on Thoughts and Prayers, wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, so what now? In other words, what are the tasks that are being undertaken right now? What are they actually working on? How, tachlis, how much is this really going to be about actual tasks that need to be carried out and not just talking about the big vision?
Yeah, it's a good point, because you just had all these committees are now formed, so they're kind of ready to go to work. But as far as like the Palestinian Technocratic Committee, the NCAG, they're basically sitting in Cairo right now. They had their first meeting in Cairo on Thursday with Nikolai Mladenov. You actually had an interesting scene where Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, Trump's top aides, FaceTimed into the meeting. But basically, it was like a meet and greet, and they have general goals set out. They have a mission statement where they talk about general ideas of what they're trying to bring: stability and security and justice for Gazans. But in terms of actual practicality, they're kind of they're spinning their wheels at this point. My understanding is they have they're going to just be at this hotel in Cairo for another couple weeks. It could be up to a month, because they don't really know what comes next. I think they're trying to be based in Gaza, but until they get maybe the ISF going, or more money or any money from the U.S., so they're basically waiting for this first meeting of the Board of Peace, and hopefully there'll be fundraising there. But there's not a lot for them to do, and one of the issues that they're finding is that they need civil servants, people at the lower level to be working for them. But Israel, understandably, has put a veto for a lot of these people if they're affiliated to Hamas, so if they were involved in any of the previous government, even if they were maybe in the education ministry or whatever it was. But understandably, I think Israel wants to see reforms there. So that's a no for Israel. But what Israel's also saying no to right now is any involvement of Palestinian Authority civil servants. There aren't that many of them, but that's basically who's left. And if you say no to both, you're kind of out of people to hire for all these different
Right. Who else to be
ministries.
hired?
Exactly. And that's
Who
what I
else?
think that there really isn't anyone, is the argument that Arab diplomats I've spoken with have said. And that's what they feel, that there's kind of this committee's being hobbled out of the gate as a result of this. When I spoke with a U.S. official, they said, look, we're going to get the Board of Peace up and then we'll move. We don't think Israel's going to maintain this veto, and we'll be able to actually get some of these civil servants, even if they were affiliated with the PA. And even in some cases, I think if it's a certain health ministry person, or some of these non-political offices, there might be more wiggle room to even have technically affiliated with Hamas, because that was just the government in charge. And that could be how things move forward. But the bigger issue is that you haven't even started the negotiations about disarmament. And that's what's going to really be able to move forward. And if you want to see any, I think, Israeli flexibility on these issues, it's going to come with them seeing progress on the issue of disarmament. And those negotiations have not started. Again, there's been talks between the mediators themselves about that we can differentiate between heavy and light weapons. And we think that Hamas could agree to something, even if it's symbolic, but to get the ball rolling. But the actual Tachlis negotiations have not began. And until that happens, kind of basically the U.S. approach has been, we're going to have like the celebration in Davos this week when the first Board of Peace is meeting. But in the meantime, the life in Gaza is very difficult. We still haven't gotten the body of the last hostage back. And you're seeing tents that are falling apart because of the very
Yeah.
cold conditions in the winter. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Gazans right now, if not over that, to the million number who are living in tents. The majority of the 2 million are displaced. And there's a lot of restrictions that have been maintained on what's allowed to go into Gaza, because Israel's concerned about it being used for weapons. So like poles for the tents are not allowed at metal poles, because those are seen as something that could be considered a dual-use item. And therefore, the tents are barely standing up in a lot of these cases. And the mediators I spoke with said, look, once we get things going, then Israel will be more flexible. But if there's no progress on disarmament, then I think we're going to be hitting a wall, and a lot of these committees won't succeed.
Right. Okay. Let's close out the podcast by talking about the charter, the Board of Peace charter, which is something you have delved into in the past, but is it more finalized in a sense? What really are we looking at in terms of an order, of the order of items that need to be addressed, or that they're looking to address in this charter? Is it constitutional in a sense?
Yeah, they're trying to make it as legal, as official as possible. Actually, I don't think I have talked about this yet, because we didn't know it existed to this degree. I got a hold of it, and I think we were the first people to publish the full text of it on Saturday. But basically, it was sent as an attachment to the invitation that each world leader received. I don't think we talked about which world leaders are going to be joining Trump so far, but I think I saw Hungary just now. Australia, I believe, got one. Jordan, Egypt, Erdogan in Turkey got one. Prime Minister Netanyahu, I believe, also. That hasn't been publicly announced, but I think they're basically just sending it to everyone. There's been dozens upon dozens who have gotten invites to this Board of Peace. And what's notable about the charter is that it doesn't mention Gaza. Because what the goal is, and I did a little bit of reporting about this a few weeks ago, is that there is this vision that this Board of Peace will be used to help solve lots of conflicts. And that's kind of what you see in this charter, that it's going to be trying to usurp the UN in a lot of ways. There's a lot of hostility in the Trump administration and in Israel towards the UN.
Toward the
So
UN.
maybe we can create this new body that will help address world conflicts. And I think you could see it being the way that the Trump administration is going to expect leaders around the world to engage with it through this body if it wants to get involved in any sort of conflict management. And I think that will be the way to legitimize the Board of Peace. But what's important to note is that the Board of Peace, at least there was this resolution in the Security Council in November that was passed about the Board of Peace. And it basically gives it a mandate to take over Gaza for 2 years. But that's it. It's not all world conflicts, and it's not forever. So there's really a 2-year window. Yes, there's this now, the Trump administration has taken that Security Council resolution and tried to build on it to make it about everything. But legally, or based on what the UN allowed it to do, it's only to focus on Gaza and only for 2 years. But in the meantime, they're trying to create something much bigger. And you have, I think what's caught a lot of headlines is that you have this $1 billion buy-in. It's not really exactly that. What it is that after the first 2 or 3 years that you're on this board, then if you want to maintain permanent membership, you have to give $1 billion. What's interesting about this all is that if you look at the charter, it gives basically a ton of authority to President Trump himself, and not just him as the U.S. president, but him personally. So there's a lot of the criticism I think you're seeing is that you're just giving Trump a slush fund in this situation. So it's unclear if you're really going to see a lot of people actually or countries donating. But I think especially if Trump doesn't win or if the Republicans don't win the next election, I don't know how relevant this body will be to begin with.
Right, what happens to the
3
money?
years.
Mhm.
But basically, I think one thing I did hear is that it's a way to get people personally onto the executive board or the Board of Peace. Is that will be, if you're an individual like Mark Rowan, this is your buy-in is to pay $1 billion. But I think it'll be interesting to see if there's any actual buy-in to this process, if this is something that other world leaders are interested in doing, or if this is just they're going to accept it as a way to curry favor with Trump and make sure he's not upset at them, and then move on and continue using the UN or just using bilateral relationships with different countries rather than using this body, because there's still a lot of questions about the legal legitimacies to it as a whole.
Jacob, how many countries are on the Board of Peace? Is there a finite number?
So not yet, because what we're seeing is that I know from speaking with different officials that there's been dozens of invitations sent out,
Right.
and what's happening is so far we're only seeing some of them saying that we've confirming that they received an invitation and that they're reviewing it. Others are saying we've received their invitation and we accept, but it isn't really final. And it will be interesting to see if there's certain countries. I think it's expected that if you announce that you've received the invitation, you wouldn't be doing
And
that.
you are going to be
You're
there.
probably going to be saying yes, because it won't look so good. It will be interesting to see if there are any countries who receive invitations and actually say no, thank you, and unwillingness to work with this administration. I assume that there will be very few of those, but so far, a lot of the people who have said yes are Trump's allies, the president of Argentina, Viktor Orban, and people of that, and I think probably President Erdogan, though he hasn't publicly confirmed yet that he's going to say yes. So that's kind of the makeup right now. I would expect it to be probably a couple dozen or 3 countries
A
on this
couple
board.
dozen. Mhm.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. It's a lot of people. But as you said in the start, they're not going to be the ones who are actually doing the real work of making sure this all happens.
That's correct. Yeah, I think it'll all be on this Gaza executive committee. But even that, a lot of its legitimacy and its success will come down to this disarmament question and maybe getting Israel more on board to allow for the technocratic government and and along with them to have the PA have a foothold there.
All right. We'll see what this week brings in terms of all of it. Thanks, Jacob.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jessica.
And thanks, too, for listening to the Times Visuals Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. Any questions you have, you can always drop us an email at podcast@timesvisual.com. Until next time, take care, be well, and have yourselves a good week.